Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants and speakers, for this ethics debate evening organized by the French National Heritage Institute and ICOM France. I'm delighted to be here and to welcome you alongside Emilie Girard. This session is focused on museums and rural areas and the connections between museums and the rural worlds, with this title, Museums in the Countryside. So I would like to greet you in the name of Charles Personnaz, who is the director of the INP French Heritage Institute. Unfortunately, he can't be with us this evening, and he presents his apologies for that. Thank you, Emilie Girard and Claude Maurice, and the whole team from ICOM France, with whom we've been working on preparing this evening. And we identified this subject as an area that would be useful for and would produce fruitful debates as part of our series of ethics debates evenings. And there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, because this theme of rural questions is a reality within France at the moment. There was recently a France rural plan that was presented last summer by the government, and which is being particularly led by Rachida Dati, who's the Minister of Culture, and she was calling for a mobilization of cultural players, of people involved in heritage around this whole question of rural support, focused on this theme that we've had in France of the rural springtime. And then another reason that we wanted to focus in on this is that this is a key issue around cultural policy. How can culture feed into territories outside of the main cities? How can professionals, heritage professionals, work together with people living and working in these rural territories? And since they represent the majority of the French national territory, how can we conserve and identify heritage that is conserved within these areas? Finally, in terms of the INPR, French Heritage Institute, this question of rurality is a key training issue for us. The INP trains heritage conservators, state and territorial conservators and curators who are they're all going to have this task of working in different territories wherever they are. And they always need to integrate. We train curators to integrate. And our courses include the importance of going to discover rural and territorial heritage. So in January 2023, for the Madeleine Proust promotion, we invited them to discover some new museums where we encountered Marie Lecasseur, who will be speaking this evening in the northeast of France. For a number of years, we've been asked to review our connection with rural areas and have a new perspective on these rural spaces in order to define better our work there and have a new perspective on natural areas in this context of ecological transition and issues associated with climate change, with a real desire to better study the way in which human beings are working within their ecosystem. This is what museums of society, art museums, history museums are all focusing in on. They're working in on territories, thinking about mobility, know-how, and how this is passed on from generation to generation. This approach to issues between museums and rurality is also a key issue for training for the INP Training Institute, because we train curators in a number of different heritage specialities. And I think it's an area that we really need to focus on and work on, with a focus on the range of different multidisciplinarity, with a range of approaches and the plurality of perspectives. If I think in particular about what all the fruitful exchanges that can come from discussions between professionals working in museums, working in scientific, technical and natural heritage, who are all taking part in an inventory of the national heritage, thinking about all these colleagues who are also working to manage archaeological sites, natural sites, and the way in which all of the skills are being networked together. This evening is focused on local dynamics that can arise out of these discussions between elected officials, cultural and heritage professionals associations, societies of knowledge as well, and all of these different dynamics that are present in our cultural heritage world, and particularly in the rural world. So I'd really like to thank the speakers who have agreed to take us through this evening, and they're going to help us to understand this field of rurality, this country field as well. I particularly want to thank Annabelle Ténèze, who is going to be moderating this evening and facilitating it. And I'd like to hand over to you, Emilie, dear Emilie. Thank you very much, Séverine, for these opening words. It's true that the question of reality is definitely in the air at the moment, but it's been that way for a long time. This concept emerged at the end of the 1990s and has been regularly revived by various government action plans over the last 10 years. How should we define this term? The rural world covers a wide range of realities depending on the geography or history that has shaped these areas. The term today has taken on an anthropological meaning, characterizing a specific way of life, and even a political dimension which is widely communicated in the media. According to INSEE, the French Statistics Institute, rural areas are defined by low population density. Until 2020, and INSEE defined rural areas as all municipalities that did not belong to an urban unit, which meant having more than 2,000 inhabitants. Since 2021, the definition has changed to break with this city-centric approach. Rurality now refers to all municipalities with low or very low population density, according to the municipal density grid. These areas account for the vast majority of French municipalities, 88% of them in 2017, and a third of the entire population, 22 million people. The Printemps de la Réalité, Rural Springtime Initiative, launched by the French Ministry of Culture, is based on the premise that cultural opportunities are more limited in rural areas than for the rest of the population. According to INSEE, rural communities account for 16% of cultural facilities nationwide. So what about museums? It has to be said that the issue of accessibility for as many people as possible has long been on the minds of museum professionals. Locating and situating museums in the heart of their region is obviously one of the pillars of ecomuseology, a concept that was conceived in the 1960s. If the question of the distribution of cultural institutions across the country and their accessibility is still open to debate, it's undoubted because it reflects the tensions that run through our societies today. What role do museums have to play in meeting the objectives of territorial equity and cultural democratization? How can they contribute to creating society as close as possible to the individual? Scientific projects have been developed with cultural activities that have been carried out both within and without museums, traveling projects, networking establishments, partnerships that bring together museums and associations with educational structures, and the setting up of residencies. These are all ways of working to make the museum a place where social links can be reviewed, revitalized, renewed, in line with the major missions set out in the definition of a museum. In these times of crisis that we're going through, how can we reaffirm the commitment of museum professionals? Our speakers this evening are very kind to share their experience and perspective with us. Thank you for them. I'd like to thank the INP, ICOM's partner for preparing this evening, particularly Séverine, Blenner-Michel and Emilie Moen. I'd also like to think of our friends at FEMS, represented by Xavier de la Selle, for our discussions and advice on this evening's program. Many thanks to the scientific community who prepare the content for our events, and to our stenographers who make it possible for all our events to be published so quickly. And of course, I won't forget Anne-Claude Maurice and Alexia McKinney, who are indispensable to the life of our organization, as you know. I'd now like to hand over to Annabelle Ténèze, who has agreed to moderate this evening's proceedings. Annabelle, thank you so much for being with us this evening on a subject that's so close to your heart. Thank you very much, Annabelle. And thank you to everyone who's been involved in organize this evening. Thank you to the whole team from ICOM France and all of you who are here with us alongside me today. So just perhaps before just showing you the first images, perhaps I could give you a little bit of an idea of where we're going. Why did we've been talking with Emilie for some time about the access to culture and the connection between rurality and museums. But I just want to say that the experience I'm going to share with you and the perspectives I'm going to share with you come from a joining of different experiences, that the meeting point of different experiences that I've had. The most recent experience that I'm going to share with you, you've seen already the first images, is an exhibition between artists and farmers. And I was involved in co-curating this with a couple of other colleagues. And this exhibition, I need to explain a bit the background to this. Why were we able to put together this exhibition together, artists and farmers? And we did this at an abattoir as for the Louvre-Lens Museum. The reason we were able to do it is because we were able to do it because it brings together a number of questions connected to museums. A few years ago, as part of a project focused on an artist award, we had an artist called Nicolas Tubéry who worked on a particular project, and this Maquignon project that he was working on brought together within the abattoir, brought together abattoirs, they brought together butchers and farmers. Before this particular location was a museum, it became a museum later on. And so I was thinking about how interesting it was to have this event in a 19th century abattoir, which brings together a number of different countryside populations and who have been coming here now for over 100, 150 years, bringing animals from the farms to this abattoir to make this connection with urban areas. So how is it possible that the museum, which still bears the name of the abattoir, how is it possible they could have lost this contact with the rural world? So Nicolas Tubéry is an artist who was the son of a farmer. How is it that he brought in people that had never been to our museum? And this was a real subject of concern for me and a real question. And I'd been leading a contemporary art museum in a town of about 4,000 people, but has about 16,000 visitors coming through. Without counting those that also come only to visit the park of that particular museum. So there's a rural visitors, there are tourists, of course, as well that come, but it's particularly this rural population that comes. So these two things came together for me, which means that we've been talking, as you said, Emilie, about rurality since the 1980s. So why are we talking about rurality rather than the countryside? Why this term rurality? We're doing that because the rural population today has been changed. In the 1960s, about 30% of the rural population were farmers and linked into farms. Today, 1.5% of the working population are working in farms. I went actually today I've seen that 2% of the working population in France are working in culture. So that's interesting that there has been a change in professions so that now there are more professions working in the world of art and culture than in the farming world, even though each of them represent about 2% of the working population. So how is it possible that this current 2% of the working population, how can they come together? This is really the question I was thinking. And we wanted to do this exhibition to think about how our museum, at what point our museum meets the world of farms. And this is really a key issue because we're talking about rurality, which means we talk about population density. We're talking about whether there is equipment, whether the infrastructure there is there, whether there's access to service. But it also opens up this question of the natural world and the connection with the countryside and landscape, which of course is not the same in rural areas as in urban areas. So of course, this connection leads us to this really current issue of ecology and the link between the history of countryside, representation of the countryside, the heritage that we have of a history associated with the countryside and with farming, and thinking about how all of this connects into the current situation in rural areas. So the question is, there's a dual question here, the question of access to art and access to collections, but collections in rural areas, are they connected around this question of rurality or not? So it's around these questions that I just want to give you a bit of historical background, particularly in terms of the connection between the farming world and the world of museums. What is a farming museum? This is one of the focuses of this exhibition, even though 2/3 of it is also focused on artists who are working either on the countryside or rurality or the farming world. And all of these terms, of course, cross over, even though they are slightly differently defined, they have different definitions. So if I come back to this question of when do museums and farmers meet? So in 1889, there was a debate which hit their newspaper headlines in France, which is about whether the Louvre should purchase um, should should purchase a painting representing two farmers, a farming couple. It represented the farmers within society, and the question is about whether this should be bought with public money or not. So it was only 20 years later in the end that this particular painting entered into public collections, but it showed that there was a kind of the birth of a agricultural art, as it were, which was the beginning of an era. And the work of Jean-François Millet represents some of the most reproduced works in the 20th century. It's almost a farming museum of daily life that we see in his work, and this is what we showed in the exhibition. Around the years 2000, we also had an artist who talked about John Millet's agricultural harvesters, and then developed it and updated it with a contemporary approach. So it's about how we can have a modern farming perspective and connect that in also with the fact that this work has become a farming museum of daily life. All of us who come from the country, who come from the farming world, must remember reproductions of these works all over the family experience. And so this really tells us that the industrialization and rural exodus, which has fundamentally transformed the farming world, is something that created this image of this farming world, this countryside world. And this perspective is one of the fundamentals that was at the foundation of ethnography. Museums focus on popular cultures. And this is why in the Abattoir Museum, we had a representation from the Musée d'Orsay. We had a number of different paintings together with one of the most important, the largest plows from the Museum, who were very generous in their loan. Perhaps we could show the next slide. So we can see here how we managed to put together museums focusing on farming questions and also focused on the creation of ethnographic museums. And we wanted to look at the economic aspect as well of farming and think about how this reality, which at this point of acquisition in the Fine Arts Museum was actually part of real life. And so we can see a kind of distancing after a kind of avant-garde farmer modernist, which goes to Malevich and Goncharova. Of course, we need to remember that the question of representation of the farming world and the rural world was also a question of ideology, political ideology, in terms of representation and the folklore that was developed around this. And from the 1970s, 1980s, we can see once again a series of artists like Toprak-Denis, who is one of the first eco-feminist artists, whose work we are now rediscovering. And she made a field of wheat in Manhattan. And another artist, Boko, who decided to be an artist and farmer and thought about the connection between this artistic perspective, the ecological perspective. Perhaps we could move on to the next pictures now, with the work of Henri Quéco and Marine Quéco. And so with this reflection on what happened in the 1970s, we can't forget the photo report that took us back to a rural series from the 1980s. So we really can't separate out this question of museums and rurality from the very decisive and deliberate focus on the country of some artists. Perhaps we shouldn't talk about them returning to the countryside, but actually they are continuing in the world that they grew up in, and perhaps this makes it possible to create a collective museum redeveloped in a collective approach. There's a lot of different collectives present in this exhibition, and there's also a focus on objects. You can see here that there's tapestry and wood sculptures produced, which shows what the kind of artistic sculptures and other objects that could be collected today. I'm really grateful to all of the 40 or so artists that were involved in this exhibition, because it helps us to think about today's issues, and it makes it possible for our speakers who are going to help us today to define what we mean by museum and what we mean by rurality. This focus in terms of the rural framework is really important. I discovered in my research that in 1977, this was at the time when the there was it was really surprising to see that there were two books produced at the same time focused on the countryside in France and also the end of the rural era, as it were. And there was a kind of change that went on here, and this question about how artists and farmers' work come together and how they bring together is also the question of taking care of the countryside, taking care of nature, thinking about how to live with the landscape. So I think that this means that we need to think about artists in the context of the question, but also we need to think about collections within the rural world. Are they connected into rurality? Are they specific to rurality? We think about the national connections from big cities. Do they reflect rurality? So thanks to the Lille Fine Arts Museum, which invited me to do a focus in on farming works associated with rurality in their collections, and the artists have been working in rural workshops and are all participating in a number of different residencies in agricultural training college. These are key, these agricultural training colleges have some of the most residencies today. So Emilie, you were saying earlier, how can we access art and culture, and how can we be and experience museums together? How can we make sure that collections circulate? Our audiences and visitors in rural areas going to be different than in urban areas? That's also one of the questions that this this rural spring initiative is raising. Here's a final image for you. Sorry, I've been a little bit too long, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Annabelle. Let's leave you to present our speakers for today. So in the order, we're going to have Claire Delfosse, Laurent Sébastien Fournier, Marie Lecasseur, Selma Toprak-Denis, and Elie Senguedé Ngalang, and then everybody will be speaking. So Claire Delfosse, you are going to help us to understand this definition of rurality that I've looked at on many occasions: life, the countryside, rural spaces. How do we define this? We do need to understand what we're talking about. So you are a professor of rural geography at the University of Lyon and director of the Rural Studies Laboratory. Your work focuses mainly on rural areas and includes a major focus on culture and heritage in rural areas. I would like to hand over to you now so that you can shed more light on this question of definition of our research scope for this evening. Thank you very much. I am a geographer rather than a museum specialist. My work focuses on local development in rural areas and the space that culture has in our rural areas. So this evening, I'm going to try to compare museums, culture, and rural spaces and look at some characteristics linked to the what we're able to see in terms of culture in these rural areas. So let's start with some definitions. I'm going to go through this very quickly, as we have already mentioned this. So rural area is somewhere with a relative low density compared to cities, obviously. And as geographers and specialists in rural areas, when we talk about rural areas, we include market towns and villages. And I think that it is fundamental in terms of culture, because these small towns are spaces where culture is shared and there's significant exchange between people in rural and urban areas. So there's been a lot of change to the outskirts, to the definition, sorry, of rural areas since this law in 2014. There's been a lot of areas that have been grouped together, large municipal areas that have been brought together. So we've had medium-sized towns that have then been connected with villages. We can have up to around 90 to 100 municipalities grouped together within these agglomerations, which are a governing body. And we can see a real mix between mid-sized towns and also very small towns and villages. It's important to talk about ruralities because they're all different in terms of their physical components, and also with density. There are rural areas with fewer than 10 residents per square kilometre, but then we also have ones with much higher density. So allow me to show you this slide now. This is just to illustrate what was said in the introduction earlier. Until recently, the rural area was defined in a negative way. Rural was defined as what was not urban. But since 2021, INSEE has adopted a new zoning mechanism. This allows us to differentiate and to promote the specific features of these rural areas, more specifically density. And there is a grid system. I'm not going to go into the detail of how this is established, but with this new zoning, we can see the importance of rural areas, and we're able to recalculate the number of residents in rural areas compared to the previous zoning. And the previous zoning just looked at urban areas, and it actually spread into a lot of this rural space. So all of the Île-de-France department previously around Paris was considered as an urban area, whereas now we're able to classify it by population density. Rurality has changed its image a lot. It's no longer a space where we need to offset the various disadvantages. As I'm sure you can imagine, this is a place where you can build significant bonds with living beings and nature. It's also a space of innovation, and alternatives are developing compared to this dominant discourse that we've had in recent decades, particularly since the early 2000s. Innovations are not just in metropolitan areas. There are innovations in rural areas, including for culture. Rural spaces, or ruralities if you prefer, do contribute to current social transitions. New ways of considering our relationship to living beings and nature. And another important issue is that in these low density areas, there are challenges associated with mobility. So how can we access services? How can we travel to go to school, to go to work? And I'm not saying that there is no work in the countryside, but challenges regarding mobility are fundamental in these areas. And this is the context in which we need to be considering challenges associated with culture in the rural environment. I'm not convinced that there's a different public, a different audience. The socio-professional distribution in rural areas is very varied, and we do have different socio-professional categories depending on the area in question. But one thing they do all have in common is how we can get access to culture in these spaces. So I'm going to try to present as quickly as possible some of the unique characteristics that I have read and identified, and I'm looking forward to talking to you all about this. So this is specifically going to be focusing on the matter of museums in these rural spaces. So the fact that there is this relatively low density is, of course, correlated, and you said this earlier, with what we call a weakness or a lack of infrastructure and fewer establishments, fewer institutions. It's because there are fewer residents. Of course, this makes sense. And there is a lower concentration than in larger cities and metropolitan areas. But this relative low density also raises questions about cultural infrastructure, about how they will attract audiences and have enough people coming into their spaces. So as I was saying, there can be a lack of infrastructure or a weakness in infrastructure that the Ministry of Culture has mentioned. This does not mean that it is inexistent. There are museums, some that have a specific museum label and others that are just cultural centres. And there is a real cultural scene in these rural areas, and it has a number of different forms. So if you move on to the next slide, I'll be able to show you some more information. If we look at rural museums, as we've already started to say, one of the main characteristics of these areas is the importance that we give to heritage, particularly protected monuments and heritage sites. When we think of this nostalgic image, for instance, of country living, rural civilization, we also often think, and this is often linked to this folklore vision, where heritage is very important. So through the presence of historic monuments, for instance, and ethnographic museums as well, and society museums in rural territories and areas. We do have a lot of museums that are promoting heritage, whether it's remarkable buildings, such as the Cluny Museum. But there are also ethnology and society museums. These ethnology and social society museums have been very present over recent decades. And we saw in the late 60s the creation of eco-museums as well as regional nature parks with Georges-Henri Rivière. And these museums were institutes. You talked about Musem, for instance, and the collections of popular arts. These are important heritage objects, and also the link with the living world. Eco-museums isn't the only option here. We also have regional nature parks. The idea is to show how these areas are linked to specific lifestyles around rural and agricultural life. There were also fishing museums in some of the first eco-museums. So in rural areas, if we look back over history, it was not just agricultural. There are a lot of museums linked to industry and or industrial prototypes, as we saw developing in the 19th century. And the Le Creusot and Fournier-Trélans are important museums focusing on industrial heritage in the north of France. We could also mention the Eco-Museum on ceramics, which shows different activities to farming. These heritage museums increased in number, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, linked to what we called this heritage folly, if you like, this acceleration of the need to conserve a trace of what we're doing. And if we look at these industrial museums or production-based museums, there was a real development for museums focusing on local speciality products. And this was particularly promoted in the 1980s and 1990s, such as cheese museums or oil museums or museums that focus on a specific product. And this included, perhaps alongside it, there could be other exhibitions. Sometimes there are actually exhibitions in industrial production sites themselves. So other specific features linked to the characteristics of rural spaces, I would say outdoor museums, which are really focusing on this specific link with landscape and nature. I can think of the Vassivière Art Museum, for instance. I think you've already mentioned it. There's an agricultural high school as well linked to an art centre. Some museums actually play with this indoor-outdoor setup, such as the Musée de Planon, where part of it is traditional, with a farm that is from the 18th century and is classified as a heritage building, which presented different collections as well. And then we move into a new building, and between the two, there's a garden where we can also see poultry, and this is a similar situation in the Musée du Rouvermont, which is a small society museum linked to the identity of this area. But it's a conservation garden and vegetable patch. The collections are also used for agricultural development. So these indoor-outdoor museums are extraordinary. It's perhaps not necessarily a museum that I'm going to talk about here, but we often see culture associated with festivals that are outdoors, like l'Ondar, like the Festival Vent des Forêts, for instance. If you are walking through this forest in La Meuse, perhaps you'll hear about this later, you will be able to see art outdoors in this forest. Other specifics that we can see with other cultural areas, there are museums that are split across multiple sites. With the eco museum model, we'll come back to that. But the idea here was to show specific features in specific locations. There are different centers. There's the main site and then a number of secondary sites. Some museums are located in non-dedicated venues that are not necessarily always museums. So one of the characteristics of culture in rural areas and rural venues is the versatile and multifunctional nature of it. So here you can see an art center in a library and media library in Pont-en-Royan. And this is also part of the Microfolie program that they've rolled out in France, that is a cultural program. So multifunctionality, versatility. And another feature that I would like to mention on the next slide, please, is linked to moving and touring exhibitions. This is a very ancient practice that has now been launched once again with Mumo, for instance, but also artists that like to tour by transporting their own exhibition space, their own museum, if you like. These are also part of the Microfolie program, or popular education initiatives with art libraries that travel between different municipalities, a little bit like libraries used to and still do. Next slide, please. Another characteristic of culture in rural areas is this question of temporality. There have been recent studies on the importance of festivals in rural areas. Often when we think about culture in rural areas, we think that a culture is actually intended to attract tourists rather than local residents. So there can be temporality linked to opening times and seasonality between winter and summer for tourism, but also a temporality with much shorter opening hours linked to the human resources available. So I linked here the Contemporary Arts Centre Lacoux, which is only open on weekends. So we also need to be asking ourselves about this temporality. Another specific feature associated with management and the ownership of these museums, their origin, yes, but also who manages them today. We do need to highlight the importance of associative museums. It's very common in heritage museums, but also in some other museums. So these are individuals like La Cure over 50 years ago, where there are artists who used to work in these museums and used to work in these venues, and create art, and then founded an association. And also partnerships between local authorities and associations. I am insisting on this because associations are very important for culture in rural areas, and this is quite original. There's also this importance of private museums and private collections, whether for heritage or art museums. This is another characteristic of rural museums. Some residents, whether permanent or seasonal residents, they create their own cultural associations in order to meet their cultural needs. We see this for arts and screening rooms and also for museums in rural areas. Next slide, please. So very quickly, I would now like to outline, when we're talking about culture in rural areas, we do need to think about challenges associated with cooperation. This is necessary because of the funding, and in rural areas, funding for culture is often through local development loans rather than more major funding streams. And it's cultural institutions that play an important role in the local development of cultural institutions or cultural structures in the local area. They're able to facilitate the existence of some local institutions. So eco-museums, for instance, are able to play a role supporting other museums or other cultural stakeholders simply. This also means that in rural areas, there can be competition between cultural stakeholders because budgets are smaller and in any case associated with local development. A key question in rural areas is the question of cultural engineering, which can be played by museums in the local area. Cooperation between cities and countryside, this idea of going towards one another, which you've already talked about, museums in this Microfolie program. And we also think too often that we're moving urban culture towards rural areas, but perhaps we need to do this in the opposite direction, as you showed earlier. as well through exhibitions in urban areas where we're showing country living, and creation is happening in rural areas. As you said, it's very attractive and it really does attract artists. Then cooperation between museums and other cultural stakeholders. We have worked on local contracts for awareness raising of culture in rural areas, CTEAC, in order to have cultural projects across different municipalities. It was quite difficult. In any case, in the experiences that we saw, there was some difficulty cooperating between museums and other cultural stakeholders under this kind of project. And I think a question is also raised about this development of third spaces, cultural third spaces. And I do think there is a cooperation between museums and these cultural third spaces. I am almost finished. So there are major questions associated with mobility and accessibility, because there are museums in rural areas, but how can we attract visitors from the city to rural areas? We need to be thinking about mobility and accessibility with the public transport as well. The website, there's an extract from the website of the Lacoux here. And there's a large museum in the peri-urban area. This is for contemporary painting and architecture in the outskirts of Lyon. And there is this question of how to get to these museums if you're a tourist arriving in Lyon. This is a real question. This is a question for rural residents, but it's also so that these rural areas can attract visitors. So we're talking about soft mobility here as well. The question of governance as well. Earlier, I talked about major changes in rural areas and the fact that these municipalities have been merged together. And this does raise questions about the ownership of museums that belong to a municipality, then a municipality of municipalities, and so on. And there are also questions associated with private museums and museums owned by associations. So who owns these collections? If an owner stops or passes away, is it stopped? And there can be conflicts between associations that have run a museum and local authorities that take it over, for instance, with different rules regarding the collections. That is my final slide. I do apologize. I think I have gone over the time allocated, but I do have time to answer any questions later on if you would like to.
Yes, and thank you very much. It's true that we've both of us gone slightly over time. But I've just picked up a couple of things from what you shared that have really mucked me. You talked about the anchoring or the connection in with a local area. You talked about know-how and heritage, this connection into know-how and heritage. You talked about eco museums and also this connection with contemporary museums and creators. We talked about these connections between urban areas and rural areas and the kind of going both ways. We've wanted to focus on residencies within countryside areas. That's something that's very important. You've talked about polyvalency, flexibility, something that's really very important, and places that can host residencies, innovation places for polyvalency, for flexibility. It's true that the Vessivière Art Center is on an island, which is also connected into an industrial modification and hydroelectricity dam. And there's another one that's in a 17th century vicarage. And then there's another one that's based in a castle. And so you've talked about mobility and this question of the going between the countryside and the city. What we haven't yet mentioned is residencies, art centers, and also FRACs. These are the regional contemporary art funds in France, and they work a lot in rural areas, but they're always working in co-construction projects together with elected officials or with individuals that they work together with to give a more higher profile to what they're doing. So of course, all of these questions really are connecting to current social questions, and there's a connection into rural areas. So yes, it's very interesting what you've said. Thank you very much. So thank you. So I'm now going to hand over to Laurent Sébastien Fournier, who's a professor of anthropology at the University Côte d'Azur and a member of the Laboratory of Anthropology and Clinical Cognitive and Social Psychology. He is chairman of the Scientific Council of Salagon Museums and Gardens and of the French Ethnological Society. He wrote a thesis on the transformation of agricultural festivals, and he will be talking to us about almost a case study in terms of what you've already presented, Claire. And he'll be talking about local agricultural projects, the sociology of agricultural workers, and more generally representatives of nature in popular festivals. He's also worked a great deal on ethnology. He's an ethnographic museum expert, and so we're really delighted to have you with you to talk about Salagon Museum and Gardens in Haute-Provence, because we're talking about this question of reality. And as we've seen from Claire, this is really something that covers the whole of the French territory and applies across France. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this event. So what I'm going to focus on is perhaps much more modest than my colleague, because at the request of the director of the museum, I am speaking today as the president of the Scientific Council of our museum, of the Salagon Museum and Gardens. So this is a drone view of our institution, which offers an initial contrast between the institution as it was and as it can now be presented today through the technical tools that we have. Perhaps before going into this case and really presenting it, because I think there's quite a lot of people here that don't know the place and it's worth talking about, but I'd just like to add to what my colleague has just said, Claire Delfosse. And I thought that connected into this question of rurality, as an ethnographer and an anthropologist, I think there are some varieties which are important to highlight. Behind the notion of rurality and rural areas, there are different types of traditional agricultural culture, and they don't all have the same heritage. So we won't necessarily in Germany have the same rural focus in a region that was marked by intensive wheat agriculture in the 18th century, for example, or in a region, for example, which I'm talking about, where there's kind of been a subsistence polycropping with a whole range of different farming. So these things will be presented in very different ways. They have very different heritage. In the same way, new rural residents who've been coming into the rural areas for the last 50 years. They are marking the territories in a very different way, and I think there's a very diverse range of developing rural areas as there is with culture. There, Delfosse showed us some images which talk about a number of different spaces in Ardèche, in Séverine, or in Salagon. These are the Provence-Alpes regions, so we're in the province hinterland. We're about 100 kilometers from Marseille, 100 kilometers from Avignon. There's been a lot of rural people moving into this area, into these rural areas in the 1960s and 70s. A lot of people going back to the land. It was almost like the countryside was reinvented in the 1970s. So we can't really play with that neo-rural and work with that neo-rural approach in the same way as other longer term and more historical rural aspects. And if I think as other aspects linked into diversity of rurality, there is, of course, other more important issues as well, such as religion, which connects into sociability. We can think about Protestant areas and Catholic areas, which are really treated in very different ways. Social connections, family connections are all represented very differently between Protestant and Catholic areas, and that would be something that would be really interesting to study at a national level across France. In the same way, there's a involvement of politics and economics. If I think of the experience that I've had in a winemaking world where they particularly promote their heritage in a particular way and develop exhibitions and work together. And so there's a whole number of contextual factors, and I think it was just that this was I just thought of this as Claire Delfosse was speaking earlier on. In terms of Salagon, the place that I'm talking about today, it's a Renaissance priory, a Roman church building with 6 hectares of garden, all of which have are certified as for the French museums, and also they have a remarkable gardens certification and also an ethnopole certification, which is less well known but comes from the Ministry of Culture. There are 1,700 different plants, 5,000 ethnographic objects, and the place has we receive about 30,000 visitors a year. So this site has been occupied since the Neolithic period. It was then Christianized, and my predecessor with the presidents of the scientific community, he was an archaeologist, and he was focused on a lot of archaeological vestiges that were archaeological remains, that were found in the gardens, and a lot of these are present, and there's a continuity between archaeology, ethnography, and botany here in this site. And the establishment was associated with the discovery of a priest who made this discovery, Pierre Martel, he was called, and he discovered this place and started to gather collections as part of an association called Alpes de Lumière, Alp of Light, and this was an association that published a lot of brochures associated with local knowledge and a local knowledge society. And so this Pierre Martel priest was an activist for culture in the 1950s. He knew Jean de Rivière. He took part in URSS in 1965 at the foundational meeting for the regional natural parks, and then in the 1970s this place continued to be run by associations and was connected into the eco-museum movement in 1981, the municipality acquired the site, the municipality of Man, and the ownership was later given over to the department uh, authority. So there's a transition from a museum run by associations to a public institution, which has become relatively important because within our rural department, there are two main museums, two main public museums. There's the Museum of Prehistory in Canasson and Salagon. The site is publicly managed since the year 2000, and it's managed by a representative of the department, the Heritage Department. It's a museum focused on the Provence region, focused on ethnography in other areas, and surrounded by these gardens. So I'm now going to show you the different areas that we're working on, just to give you an example of what can be done in this kind of site. And it's fairly representative of what happens in other rural museums. If we look at the ethnobotany aspect, I can talk about the temporary exhibition, which is currently ongoing in Salagon. This is the Olivier Mon Arbre, olive tree, my tree. And so these are objects that have been loaned by a number of friendly museums, either close by or further away. And the speciality of this museum is that there is a partnership put in place with a European program funded by the University of Avignon and the Écluse area, which on the next slide we can see another perspective around this. So it's museographic, in museographic terms, it's inspired by ethnographic museums in the traditional way. Every year we have a temporary exhibition which covers the main area. And then we have a supplementary exhibition which uses objects from the permanent collection. And here we have an ethnographic exhibition alongside a thematic exhibition on agriculture. We've got this temporary exhibition on old toys, and this is based on the permanent collection since the time of the priest Pierre Martin. And then we've also got we do some contemporary art exhibitions every year. Works are ordered or installed. We also have some stained glass work, which is also very attractive. And then there's another part of our work on the next slide, which is focused in on archaeology. There's a permanent exhibition on the history of the site, which makes it possible to have an interpretation of the archaeological remains conserved during work on the site and excavation work around the site. So this is the main focus of our exhibitions. And then if I carry on with the next slide, which really focus in on the training courses that we host. And these are focused on intangible cultural heritage, particularly on botanical aspects, because as an ethnopole, an ethnography hub under the French Ministry of Culture, we are listed on the intangible cultural heritage list, particularly focused on popular naturalist work, which is focused on social uses of local plants. So He is what we call the padesson in the local language, which led to a local botanist who was really very well known, but was really very locally based. And throughout his life, he ran a botanical training course, which was actually recognized at a national and international level and was connected into the Salagon site. Here you can see the document center. We have students coming together. I took this photo as part of a session that I was running about 2 or 3 years ago, and here we are training students from local universities, regional universities from Aix-Marseille and Nice Côte d'Azur universities. We're training them to do documentary research in heritage, ethnographical collections as well, and also intangible cultural heritage. So that's how this site really operates. Since it's a rural area, it's important for there to be a number of different aspects. There's the exhibition area, there's the training area, there's the gardens. All of this works together. Perhaps on the next slide, yes. Here this illustrates and gives a link to a research blog where we publish the proceedings of various seminars that we run. We also have, therefore, some publishing activity that we're doing. I don't have very much time to explain everything that we're doing, really, but I really want to invite you to come to our site. So the last slide, yes, is just a little ad just to give you the address in Man, and these are the visiting times when we're open. And so the publications that are online, they're on this blog. Perhaps we'll give you a bit more information that will back up what I've been saying here today. And we do research work because we can't necessarily make a separation between urban areas and rural areas, but we're in a rural area, but which is really at the center of a whole range of networks that are international and open up to the big agglomeration, Aix-Marseille, which is just Aix-Marseille metropolitan area, which is just nearby. So there is this connection into urban areas. I was planning to talk a little bit about museum networks, but I think the next speaker will talk more about a network of museums in another French region. And if you wish, when we have the discussion time, we could come back to this question about the relations that we have with other museums, other rural museums within our region. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be ready to respond to any of your comments and questions. Thank you very much. Well, you really did the transition for me perfectly there with the next speaker, but I'd just perhaps like to highlight a number of points that you've just raised there, and it's been really excellent. We can't have a uniform approach to rural areas in France. I think that's something that's really important. I don't think any of us want to do that, but it's really good to highlight it. Like you say, I think every place has its own history, and that's the very specific nature of the museums that we're talking about. While, as you say, we're talking, we talk a lot today about the diversity and diversification of collections within museums. The example that you have talked about and the way of working with these different collections is already emblematic of the way these different collections work and how they connect in together across the strata of history. And of course, for you, there's this connection between botany, contemporary art, and archaeology. And as you were saying, there's no separation between global and local, if I can use these perhaps standard terms, but they do come back a lot in the debate. I think that's really important to mention. As Claire said, we have to get out of this idea, get away from this idea of a one-way exchange. It's really important, the fact that you've talked about training, you've talked about the research blog, and that's something that's really important. You also take part, I think, in European programs together with the University of Avignon. And so this question of sharing research and training is really very fundamental wherever we are based. I think we really need to take each different place seriously. And that's what's really important when we talk about rurality. Often there's an accusation made against people that come from outside, and we say that they're not really connected in. This is something that comes back a lot when territorial staff or elected officials take part in different meetings. It's really important to think about the specific nature and specific strength of different sites. Thank you very much. And so that makes us a brilliant segue into Marie Lecasseur and what she's going to be saying. She's head of the Conservation and Development of Heritage and Museums in the Meuse department in northeastern France. This organization is really focused around this and represents a network approach which goes beyond the ideas of heritage and territorial organization. So Marie Lecasseur, you are specialist in Renaissance, early Renaissance architecture. You were responsible for a organization focused on architecture, and it's now 20 years that you've been responsible for the heritage conservation department in the Meuse department in northeastern France. You have collections with the Muséum de France certification or label, and you're going to talk about how this network approach works within the Meuse department in northeastern France.
Thank you very much. Let's launch the presentation. I would like to show you the work that I am doing. So here you can see the summer residence of former presidents, and left this to the department. And we decided to move our conservation, heritage conservation and promotion department to this museum. And we're working closely with history, politics, culture. In this next slide, you can see that we work as a department level agency with 7 museums. So 2 of them are department owned museums. You just saw one of the photos of this, Montmédy, and then also the museum very close to the Belgian border, the Beer Museum. You can really see how large our department is. It takes 2.5 hours to go from north to south. We wanted to pool our resources through 2 hubs with this department level ownership of the Beer Museum, which was previously a association run museum. This was led by the department since 2008. And we have someone working with the Beer Museum and then the Musée d'Argonne and the Musée Jules Bastien Lepage and then the Musée de la Princerie. And then I work with Musée d'Art Sacré, Musée de la Céramique et de l'Ivoire, Musée Jeanne d'Arc. And I think that's it, yes. The Musée Barrois that you can see and the Musée Raymond Poincaré are under the French Museum label, but they're not directly run by our department. They are located within a larger municipal agglomeration with around 17,000 residents. But in other museums, there are smaller numbers. I used to run the Musée de la Pincerie, which is in a town of 20,000 residents, but I thought that it would be better for the administrative management to be shifted up a little bit. The Musée de la Pincerie is no longer scientifically managed by our department and has not been so since 2009. So I'm going to show the diversity of collections that we manage, and perhaps you would like to know what we do. So we have 7 museums under our scientific control. We are no longer called the Scientific Conservation of La Meuse. We are called Heritage Conservation and Promotion. We are in the Lorraine Grand Est region, and we have been commissioned to promote heritage, and many of these museums are directly linked to heritage. So the team currently has 14 people approximately devised across the different hubs. So 8 of them are in the south and 6 in the north, and we are trying to pool our resources across the department. And that is why some of the other museums in the list would have been a little bit too much. So each hub has a heritage curator, a collections manager, administrative staff, mediators, cultural mediators working with the public, and also people working with public-facing reception activities. You saw the map of them earlier, and so the castle, the former residence of Raymond Poincaré, Saint-Pigny. So he was president of France from 1913 until the First World War. He did not have any children and wanted this chateau to be an orphanage for abandoned children, which it was for many years before it was transformed into a museum by the department. You should also bear in mind, and we can talk about this beer museum now, Musée de la Bière. So it represents 70,000 objects, and then there are around 5,000 objects in the previous one. Since 2008, this Musée de la Bière, this beer museum in Senguedé, this is a museum of ethnology, an ethnographic museum, and very local museum in a former malt factory. The majority of our collections are held here. This is a museum of 2,000 square meters. This is much larger than the one I just presented. We've visited this. When we talk about pooling our resources, so previously 3 technical agents that I had were able to rework the museography and signage of this beer museum. There are some unique features I'd like to talk about, particularly about pooling resources in rural areas. This was taken over by the department because there was a real desire from the association and the municipality. So this was created in the 80s, and they built up most of the collections. And in the 1980s, there were a lot of breweries closing in the east of France. So instead of throwing all of this out into landfill, the association played a heritage role by collecting these objects. It became a label as French Museum, over 5,000 objects, like I said, that saved this industrial brewery heritage and is now the museum of reference in Europe on beer. It's interesting because there are three parties managing the site. So firstly, the Meuse department. In 2012, we transferred ownership from the association to the department, and the city committed to restoring the building. And in the past 15 years, the municipality has provided 1 million in repairs, and they provide electricity, water, etc., and security. And a beer museum would not be a beer museum without some tasting at the end. And the association since 2008 have continued to maintain the bar, the tavern at the end of the museum, as this is a lot easier for them to do than it would have been for us. So there is a significant temporary exhibition space as well that is open to cultural exhibitions. And the association is able to use that space. Next slide, so we can keep going, sorry. So this is the Musée d'Art Sacré, the Sacred Art Museum in Saint-Mihiel. Once again, this is promoting heritage. This opened in 1986, and in the early 90s, there was this desire to build this in a disused Benedictine monastery in order to promote sacred objects from the church, so that that had been taken from churches that were no longer used for worship today. The music has around 5,000 objects, and 90% of it is taken from Meuse. It's very important through different conventions between the municipality, as it's a municipal museum, and we provide scientific management, and the local municipality, the municipality donating the objects remains ownership, and they actually recover some objects for some of their heritage events. There are some incredible relics from the 1600s, for instance, that goes to Forchâtel, to the original place where it was taken for the local fete every year. So the majority of the objects in these showcases are taken from historical buildings. This museum was the first of its kind in France in the 1990s, and there are only around 10 of them. And a number of departments call us regularly to ask how we are able to manage this. Next slide, please. Musée de la Céramique et de l'Ivoire, Ceramics and Ivory Museum in Commercy. This doesn't mean that there is a heritage of industry in ceramics and ivory. Somebody was a passionate collector of ivory and ceramic who lived in Commercy, a private owner. And this is the old municipal buildings you can see here. And there are temporary exhibitions with contemporary artists as well, with a lot of paintings particularly. We have a partnership with the Angers Fine Arts Museum, but you can't see this in the picture. Next slide, please. The Musée Jeanne d'Arc, the Joan of Arc Museum in Vaucouleurs, because Joan of Arc came from the Vosges, but in Vaucouleurs is a place that is of great importance in the story as she traveled through here. And so this is a museum of reference, even if it is a very small museum with just 4 little rooms. And this shows the evolution of Joan of Arc imagery over time, with the jade, for instance, of Marie d'Orléans, And we can see both secular and religious portrayals of Joan of Arc. There is a room that is focused on publicity and advertising. There was even cheese sold under the brand of Joan of Arc at one point. Here we have the Musée d'Argonne, an ethnographic museum in Varennes-en-Argonne. This dates back to the 1970s. We are still managing this, and this is the only one that has not changed hands in this time period. This is showing ethnographic through the production of glass, and this started through prehistoric times, through Gallo-Roman times as well. Next slide, please. Musée Jules Bastien Lepage and Fortification in Montmédy. This is in a citadel. And there's an interpretation here with objects that show the evolution of this science of fortification from historical times right up to the modern day. And on the ground floor, there are two rooms based on Jules Bastien Lepage. We had a retrospective exhibition on Bastien Lepage in collaboration with the Musée d'Orsay, with works of art from around the world in order to have this monographic exhibition, which was first visible in Orsay and now for us. So this is a country painter and was painting from the second half of the 19th century with some famous paintings in the Musée d'Orsay. He also did portraits and was very good at selling portraits, but is currently known for his paintings of the French countryside. We are the museum of reference for Jules Bastien Lepage, who came from a village not far from Montmédy. I talked about this earlier, the Musée de la Princerie and the Musée Barrois. These are the two oldest museums from the 19th century. Like many rural museums, there are ethnographic, Egyptian, African collections right up to contemporary art. On the left-hand side, you can see a work from Debussy, who is a famous sculptor. The Musée Barrois is being renovated at the moment. It is currently closed, and there are some changes to the collections at the moment. Next slide, please. I was talking earlier about the fact that our service promotes heritage. We have somebody who's been working over the past 7 to 8 years with heritage itineraries, heritage routes or trails. So Digerissier, who was a major artist in the 19th century, who's not very well known nationally or internationally, but there were two works of art that we were able to work with. And between heritage and museums, in 2016, we received a statue of Saint Elizabeth. I should have shown you the picture of this. And we created a scientific committee with Sophie Jugine and with people working in sculpture at different museums. Paul Churet, who is a sculpture manager for Lorraine, and we were able to look at this work. So there was a legacy from a family. They donated this, and a survey was carried out about where this came from. We've worked with Vendée Forêt, which you mentioned earlier. They asked for work with a contemporary artist that created artwork that we can find on the trails by the forest with this full story of this Saint Elizabeth. And this was a really major event. And it will leave a lasting mark in my professional memory. The remarkable churches of La Meuse. We were working with the GA16 hiking trails as well. And for many years, we wanted to look at these remarkable churches. We were unable to work with them before, and it was our service that was able to go to 200 churches to do recon work. And we wanted municipalities to open up and ask us when we could get the keys to the churches to open them up, or when the churches were open. So this exists since 2018. This really does require a lot of work, but because we have to write to the 119 municipalities after all elections to make sure that we can still access these churches and what the opening conditions are. Giulio Donzelli. This is linked to Valérie Donzelli, a famous filmmaker who was there when we launched this trail in 2019. And in 2021, there was a group of people that have been working on the 1% artists that we call it. This is another of our trails. In the next slide, you can see how we promote Gallo-Roman sites, particularly Nisium and Senon. We promote these two important sites, and we work with young volunteers who are volunteering in order to support these sites. I didn't mention this earlier, but the trails are very interesting because the department does work with elected officials. None of the works are classified as historical relics. I think that this will happen in the future, but elected officials provided political support to have a dedicated budget of over 400,000 euros in order to implement this trail, to make sure that 16th, 17th century relics in churches could be opened up, and supported municipalities with 50% of the restoration costs as well. After reconstruction, churches were often built in concrete and are poorly ventilated, and we're seeing salt in intrusion, so we're having to restore some of these churches. And there was also automatic lighting funded at 50%, so that when visitors arrive in a church, the lighting turns on if you're coming in autumn or winter. If you can't see the frescoes in the church, there's no point. So we really do want to promote this heritage and support municipalities in promoting it. Next slide, please. We also wanted to implement a digital strategy during COVID, of course, and we were fortunate to work with Mr. Omer Pesquier, and I think that he's quite well known for the Museodrome, and he supported us in our digital strategy. This is for our service, our very small department where we don't have many financial resources. We're working with communication, and we've got 400,000 with 200,000 in investment and 200,000 in operating costs. So he helped us to develop our Facebook page and Instagram, and then to create a digital PWA application. This is a visitor application called a PWA that you can download. And we launched this in April of this year with the Orfeo company. So Omer Pesquer and his colleague Michel really supported us in all of this work, so that this application is working really well. And you can see the 3 pictures here. Next slide, please. We're trying to remain up to date and ensuring gamification of our museums. People come with children and families now, and in rural areas, there is an aging population. But in 2012, La Meuse had 192,000 in population. But I think population decline is quite alarming because we're now at 140, 150,000. So this is 31 inhabitants per square kilometer. I've not told you this, but of the 9 museums that we manage before COVID, we had up to 78,000 visitors, and we're at about 60,000 now. And there's 20,000 to the beer museum immediately because it's best placed geographically, and I think people like the topic. So in the Saint-Pimy Museum, you can see we talked about the orphanage period, and we have an escape game for pasta at the beer museum, and we work with school children in this. For the Saint-Piny site, which also has a garden, we've been working for many years that we want to be a sensitive nature area. And we've got these signs that have been launched this year so that children and families can discover the fauna and flora of the site and the different historical aspects. I think that's everything I had to say. I have forgotten one thing. We've been talking about innovation, and I think we were quite proud in 2028. This was the second year that the Minister of Culture had this label, Hors les murs, and we received this label in the past 10 years. We've had collections that we've been able to do outside of traditional venues, in prisons, for instance, that we organized with an American rapper, and then also in elderly care homes where we work on various topics that residents choose based on our collections.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very rich presentation, which really highlights everything we've been talking about since the beginning, is how we can work in networks, how we can pool things together while also maintaining our specific characteristics. How can we have a number of people? You were saying you have 60,000 visitors for a department of 180,000 people in the region. That's really a very significant level. That means you've got a third of visitors proportionally to the population of the region. Thank you also for reminding us how this scientific work and the quality of this work can be done at a whole number of different scales. That's something that's really important to highlight in terms of collaboration. And also, it's really helpful to think about heritage and museums. When I talk about heritage, I mean management of furniture, as it were, and other aspects, how that can all come together. So thank you very much for this presentation. And in terms of this question associated with circulation, and pooling, I'm going to hand over now to Selma Toprak-Denis, who is Deputy Director of Public Affairs and Head of the Cultural Mediation Department at the Centre Pompidou. She runs a lot to do with cultural outreach at the Centre Pompidou, and she also worked at the Normandy Impressionist Festival and was General Secretary of Tram Réseau Art, the Contemporary Art Network in Paris and the Paris region. She has a lot of experience in terms of the question of the circulation of works, and she's going to be talking about the Centre Pompidou, about the MOMU, the Mobile Museum project that they're running. And she'll be talking about some of the stages where this MOMU system has been present, initiative has been present in rural areas. Good evening, and thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be with you. Before I get really into the topic of the MOMU work that we're doing in rural areas, I just want to give you an introduction to the Pompidou Center because we are really very much removed from rural areas. When you think of the Pompidou Center, you can see this is our building, which was opened in 1977 and is really in central Paris. People who know us better perhaps go beyond our building and they think about our collections or contemporary art and also the interdisciplinarity, because we're not only a museum, but we also have a public library. We have a culture and recreation department, and we run a number of different projects in France and abroad. So the rural aspect of all that is connected into our mission as a national public establishment which includes, of course, rural areas. So first of all, this connects into our loan policy. We loan about 6,000 works every year, half of those within France, and about 40% of that is outside Paris. Then this question of mobility and circulation is something that's been really at the heart of the Pompidou Centre's work. And an example of this is the mobile Centre Pompidou, which was a huge student marquee that moved from town to town. And then we've got activities in a whole number of different areas across France. Today, what we're trying to do is to co-develop projects with partners. And I'm just going to very quickly present, because I think this is really a very important example. This exhibition, which will be open at the end of June in Le Puy-en-Velay in Auvergne, in the middle of France. And there's this exhibition which has been developed together with the Musée Crozetier on representations of rurality. This has been put in place in partnership with the head curator at the Musée Crozetier and the head of modern collections at the Pompidou Center. They've worked together to co-develop this, as well as another colleague from the Centre Pompidou. The Musée Crozetier is going to be involving a number of different objects linked into this question of rurality. Then we've also got the One Day, One Work initiative, which we have developed in order to get pieces moving around the Paris region and going towards people who are a long way from the Centre Pompidou, perhaps more in social terms, or in their capacity to move, rather than for geographical reasons. They might be distance for health reasons or social reasons from the museum. So the goal is to take a work outside of the museum. That's quite challenging because you have to transport the work and then develop a presentation with very little resources, and then develop a whole cultural mediation system all around this. So we put in place a conference or a lecture that is put in place by a cultural expert, and then there are also events run for younger visitors, because the goal is to see a work moving around, but we want to maintain this Pompidou Center touch, as it were, which is really defined by working with artists in a multidisciplinary approach. And particularly, we want to try and invite visitors to get involved in action and doing things. So you can see that here, you can see in the Balancourt-sur-Essonne, which is a small town with about 7,000 people to the south of Paris. And you can see a photo here of a workshop created by a young artist who we invited and who was with us that day. We present a whole number of different works from our collection. The next one will be by Nicolas de Stael, and that'll be going to Massy at the end of June. Another initiative that we run is that we also commission works. And so we asked Nathalie Crassi, who is a designer, to create a fairground ride. We thought about this together and we thought it through to put in place an initiative that we could install and put in place and leave it in place for a number of weeks or months, connecting to a heritage establishment or a municipality. We take the fairground ride to the site and then we train the team, and then the whole team runs it. It doesn't need electricity because it's run by the energy of parents who pedal in order to get the different aspects of the fairground ride running with a background soundtrack as well. And the whole idea of this is to have an approach to contemporary art and contemporary design, because we have a significant part focused on contemporary design in our collections, but we also want something to be interactive and that can be interacted with. Another initiative is the Fabrique Mobile, the mobile manufacture. We have created this in order to meet the need of local municipalities within the Paris region to work in their area with workshops that can be easily rolled out both outside and inside. So there's always this Centre Pompidou approach, and we run workshops created by architects or designers or artists. Here on the photos, you can see the mask that the little girl has got with her, and this was created by a designer, and the other aspects have been developed by architects working on these areas, and we can use all of this to create a whole story, a whole narrative, which might encourage people to come to the Centre Pompidou and find out about everything else that we offer. We're once again working in partnership with local partners. We bring the infrastructure and we train the teams who can then put it in place as often as they like with the different audiences that they want to work with. So this is something that we've really strengthened and worked on a lot more over recent years. Another project is that we work on taking workshops and transporting workshops around, particularly for early childhood between 0 and 2 years, in libraries or cultural centers, for example, who really do appreciate this kind of workshop. And of course, we carry out other workshops with artists within the Paris region. But there's also a project, for example, that was run in northwest France in Brittany, focused on contemporary art, contemporary creation. And so now I really want to come to the MUMO, which is the Mobile Museum. This is a partnership project which was created by Ingrid Brochard with an initial truck which was created in a container. You can see that at the top left there. It was created in 2011, and then a second MUMO was created, and it is still running. It was designed by Nathalie Tressé, and it carries works from the FRAC, Regional Contemporary Art Fund, and CNEC. And then the third MUMO has been traveling since June 2022, and it was created by an architecture agency in connection with another artist. So these are really partnership projects that we develop with the association founded by Ingrid Rocha, which created MUMO, and another foundation that supported us to build these trucks. And then we've also had support from the French Ministry of Culture and the different municipalities that host us. So if we go a bit more into the architecture of the truck, so the designs provided by the architects, you can see how it travels when it's closed. It's a real truck, a real lorry. And when it stops, you can open it out, a bit like an accordion, to produce an exhibition hall. And you can see on the photo on the right, that it also opens out to a sort of terrace area where you can do workshops and project restitution events. There's a whole number of different or feedback of workshops that have been produced by children, and you can see at the bottom there's a whole number of different spaces, because there's the exhibition area, there's the kind of front space, and there's also a space that can be used to project videos, and there's an area for the driver who actually sleeps in the truck when it's stopped. So this is really an architectural challenge, which was really brilliantly executed by the team, because the Pompidou Center wants to transport works, and so it means that the climate has to be maintained, the truck has to be maintained secure, in terms of questions of vibration as it's during transport, because the works are attached to the wall, so it's really important. And it's really very important that it's properly secure, because when it's closed, it really becomes really like a safe for the security of the works. And it was important to have a projection space, because works can be cinematographic or photographic pieces which can be shown. It was also really important to have a range of different spaces there. So what you can see the exhibition room here. There's 42 meters squared here, but we really are very careful with it. As I said, we said it earlier, we really need to consider all sites and locations with a great deal of care. And so we treat this as a place as part of our museum, and we treat it really with great deal of care, working with sonographers to design the exhibitions. The exhibition room is designed so that all of the technical aspects are hidden, so that there's no visual disturbance. The works are hung, and we have a lot of children and a lot of groups come to the MUMO, and this is a very intimate space, which makes it really possible to come close to the works. You can see that we don't have any exclamation cards, presentation boards that are presented. Everything comes in a little brochure that is distributed. In terms of the themes that we select, we really seek to do these exhibitions in order to share the work of the collection and to go to as many people as possible. So we've done an exhibition on the theme of animals. It was called Animals That Come Out of Their Reserve. Another one focused on light, another one on music, another one on caravans and transport, another one that's focused on the rules of art, which is focused into games and sport, in particular thinking about the Olympic Games. So we like to have a range of different works. We like to have contemporary art, modern art. It's important to have videos, and it's really important to have a collection of a number which produces a real exhibition. And if you look on the next slide, you can see here that we work really very closely with the MUMO team. We work with local authorities to define the tours that we're going to work on and the groups that will be visiting the MUMO. So I could give you some figures from a tour that went on in the east of France from the exhibition called the Caravan du Bizarre, which was a focused on caravan culture. It went across 15 weeks of 26 stages. About 60% of that were in villages of under 2,000, population of under 2,000. We reached the five different departments in the regions, and we had 1,700, about 7,000 visitors, 64% of whom were children, and 32% of them had never been to a museum. And here we're in this eastern region where there's a lot of different museums. We've just heard from my colleague about other networks of museums, but here we're dealing with mainly with people who have never been to any museum of any kind. It's important to have that in mind. And so we often work with schools, both primary and secondary schools, but also with socio-medical centers. I think we heard earlier about this question of audiences. Is there a difference between rural audiences and urban audiences? Well, you don't really sense this anyway in terms of a reaction to contemporary art. There's no fundamentally different reaction between someone coming to a museum for the first time coming from Paris or someone coming to the first time to a museum from the countryside. The audiences and visitors are really very the same, but what people really like with MUMO is this proximity, the fact that you can come without any reserve. There's no need to check the bags and all of that. There's not this whole intimidating thing of coming into a cultural institution. This is just a truck, it's just a lorry that's there, and it comes to the center of the village or comes to the local district, and it's very easy to get into. And then the cultural mediation work is really the same as any other work, and it's as we might do at the Centre Pompidou. And we follow the same kind of approach when we want to constantly offer children and young people a real experience. So you can see here on the screen different types of visitors coming in, some different systems that we've developed. For each exhibition, we develop a different scenography, and this one is, we've got one focused on light here, another one on music, and at the top you can see a set of cards that we've just come out with, we've produced with an illustrator that helps to talk about the works and helps our young people. They take a card on the basis of a clue, they identify a work, and then they have a game which helps them to get talking and overcome any kind of timidity and shyness. Another mediation tool that we use, which was also linked into this exhibition on the rules of art because it's connected into the Cultural Olympiad. And so we worked for a number of months with a secondary school class in the Paris region, and they are about 13 or 14. They have a sport specialty and they're focused on volleyball. These are students who want to become professional volleyball players. So we worked on the rules of the game, and we talked about the rules of what it was to produce exhibition. So it wasn't really perhaps a standard curatorship because we didn't have enough time to set it up really, but we worked together with them to define how the exhibition would be presented, do a list of different works, and learn why we might put such and such a work rather than another one. We also had debate and discussion, and we talked with different professionals from the Pompidou Center, from scenography, from the curator team, because it's important for school pupils to understand there are a number of different professions Sorry, I'm just going to cut in there because I think we probably need to be wrapping up now. Thank you just for that reminder. Just to finish up then, the last slide is focused on characteristics in rural areas. There's no difference in terms of the audiences and their relationship with contemporary art, but what we can see is that the arrival of the Mumo truck is a real event. So just an example is when it arrived in Maxey-sur-Lez in the Meuse in the northeastern France, there was a village of about 300 people. When the doors opened, the opening event, we had 100 people, so a third of the whole village population was there for the event, and they came to the opening even. The same in another village with 1,600 people. We had 300 people coming to see us over 2 days between Christmas and the New Year. And so it really does create an event. There's a lot of people. It's very present in the local press and the regional press, the tours which announce each stage. And another aspect, another characteristic is this really fun feel around the arrival of the truck and the ingenious approach of local residents and the local municipalities who need to find places for the cultural mediation team to stay. So in the Marne, there was the team was hosted in an agricultural center, which was just the simplest way for it all to work. And if we could just wrap up in terms of what makes it successful, this work outside the museum, it's important to understand that whatever the format is, you can see what a range of different formats. We need to have presentations that are connected into the identity of our museum and the identity of each museum. It's also important to have local representatives, but what's really important is that these projects require a lot of time, and it's important to give them time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Selma, for this presentation. I do love that you were able to say that no, there is no difference in the public, in their reaction, but the question is really about access, mobility, to work together, to come together, to open up and welcome people in. So thank you so much for these valuable examples that you've provided. And they have been very made to measure and tailored to the specific context in which you are working. I'm going to move very quickly onto Elie Senguedé Ngalang, who is president of ICOM Chad. He has a master's degree in anthropology, and it has been a technical director of the National Museum from 2012 to 2017. He's currently assistant director of cultural heritage at the Chadian Ministry of Culture. He is now going to be looking at rural museums in a Central African context and this question of promotion of heritage, rural heritage, particularly local communities in the country of Chad. Thank you so much, Elie. Over to you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you very well. Thank you. And thank you to ICOM France for asking me to give a contribution to discussions today. It is a real pleasure. And I'm delighted to be taking part in this exercise. Next slide, please. We are going to look today at the following plan. So we're going to start with an introduction. In this introduction, I would like to say the following. Like in most African countries, museums were born in a colonial context where administrators, whether civilian or military, collected objects in order to promote them. And after independence, these collections generally remained in the possession of local communities that put them in colonial buildings. So in Chad. Here you can see images on the left-hand side. This is the former building that was the residence of the governor, and it then became the town hall and was home to other institutions. On the right is the National Museum, the Nairobi National Museum in Kenya, which is a former colonial building as well. The idea was to adapt collections to these buildings that were not initially designed in order to host these objects and museum objects. Next slide, please. Yes, so some community museums have been created through various people across Africa. The building that you can see here is home to the Bamoun Museum, which is in Cameroon. On the right is the National Museum of Chad, and this is a new building which complies with international building standards. The difficulty is that this is an ordinary building, whereas museums need to make their mark when visitors arrive. Visitors are interested to both the content and also the thing containing it, so the building. And unfortunately, many new buildings that are host to museums don't have any anything to do with local architecture and are just these generic new buildings. Next slide, please. We are going to now talk about festivals of arts and culture, which are very common in African countries. This can sometimes lead to the creation of community museums as well. African peoples in general have been aware of the need to conserve and promote their tangible and intangible heritage. This is particularly notable in the creation of community museums, as we saw for the Bamoun people. And they organize festivals of art and culture as well. These festivals are there's around 10 of these festivals in each African country. So in Chad, there's the Tokmana, which Tokna Masana as well. And this is a people group between Chad and Cameroon. And the communities from both countries come together as a diaspora to celebrate this festival. They've created a community museum, which is actually located in Cameroon and not Chad. So the Masana of Cameroon and Chad go to this museum in Cameroon, and it's become an object of integration between the two countries. And then the Kodoma, which is a community festival, once again between Chad and Cameroon. They have not yet created a museum, but their festival has contributed to the collection of a number of artistic objects. There are also the Mudang festivals, the Festival of Arts and Culture of the Tangile people. There are 16 different communities living within a single province. This is a new festival in Chad, and other groups are seeking to imitate it. There is also the Protoko Festival. They live in Cameroon, and as a community, they've come together to create this festival with a museum, but their museum is actually in Chad, unlike the Masana that decided to locate their museum in Cameroon, whereas here the museum is located in Chad. There is the International Festival of Saharan Cultures. This is a large festival and it brings together people from Niger, Sudan, Algeria, Morocco, but also from France. In the latest event 5 years ago, there were 3 French municipalities that took part in this festival. There's the Dariki Festival as well, which is unique because it is organized in the capital of N'Djamena. And festival goers come from rural areas to have fun and also to exhibit what they have to offer. Through these festivals, we have observed that it used to be political leaders who wanted visibility, who decided communities to create these festivals. People owning objects are asked to bring these objects together to exhibit them and to show them to current generations and to generations living in cities. People then ask them to leave their objects behind because they want to create a museum. But unfortunately, they are not left or stored in proper conditions, and they often degrade because of heat or because of poor exhibition equipment. This is why I said earlier that some festivals have contributed to the destruction of objects rather than the promotion of objects. Due to this problem in Chad, we decided to support them by providing expertise and advice and guidance so that we can diversify activities. For most organizers, festivals have folklore dancing, objects with explanations. So we have contributed to supporting diversification, and there are now activities such as storytelling as well, fishing, hunting practices, and many more. This is an important phase for the development of rural museums. We're supporting them by also helping communities to properly exhibit these objects. How can we conserve an object in a museum? How can we do an inventory or stock take? How can we ensure proper temperature and humidity levels, and etc.? Next slide, please. Another activity that we have carried out with these communities across different parts of the country are television shows and radio shows. In Chad, these are broadcast and people enjoy watching this. The themes vary. So there are 6 different pavilions in the National Museum of Chad. And in 2020, the Ministry of Culture received funding from the European Union, and this enabled it, along with the National Museum of Chad, to produce programs that were entitled Culture at Home. This was during the COVID-19 pandemic, where it was forbidden to come together as a group. These programs present the permanent exhibition of the National Museum in the form of guided tours. And the aim is to enable people to continue learning and to give them access to culture even when at home. To conclude, I would just like to say that these activities are carried out with much difficulty. Curators at the National Museum are very few and far between. They cannot work efficiently in the field with museums located in rural areas. The budgets allocated to support festivals and TV programs are insufficient and very intermittent. After COVID-19, the European Union has not renewed its funding, so the project to produce these TV shows, Culture at Home, has come to a stop. To conclude, I would like to say, given the increase in the rural population, it is important to promote the museum's collections in rural areas. Rural areas are very important. They are the ones that help us to feed into and contribute to the collections in our national museums. They are also the ones that take part in these festivals. And this is a place of exchange and joy. And this is why we are trying to support them in access to culture. We were not able to get information on all museums from Africa, so I focused my presentation today specifically on museums located in Chad. Thank you very much, Elie, for this presentation, and I do like what you finished on. The role of rural heritage is important. The way that it's done and these TV shows that you launched. And we're talking about the creation of events and also the creation of heritage here around this knowledge. And we do wish you an excellent future development here. And there really is a great heritage construction, as many of the speakers said today. It's about trying to build a museum together where we are based with the unique features of each location. So thank you very much. I now propose to open up to questions. Let's start since we are behind time. So we are going to start with questions from participants with us here today. I would love to just say that, Nathalie, would you like to say something? Nathalie Mémoire, I think you had something you wanted to add. Yes, thank you, Emilie. I just wanted to say a counterpoint to what was presented for Pompidou and the MUMO, because we are working in all of the La Gironde department. We have a very small vehicle. We'd studied the question of a museum bus. And for budget reasons and due to HR, it was not possible at our scale. So for 15 years now, we've been able now to get this bus after reevaluation, and we're able to work with schools that are unable to travel. We did this during the renovation period, and we continued this after our institution reopened. So this works very well. They are far away geographically, and elderly care homes as well. This is perhaps more in metropolitan areas. And we sometimes work with individuals as well, or in social institutions and their shared spaces. I don't want to say much more, but we have gathered significant experience, and sometimes people make spaces available, and we've got this vehicle that allows us to transport themed equipment. I think there's 20 to 25 of these different boards that are able to target different ages and different themes. Thank you very much. We have heard of some examples of touring collections, but there is a real diversity of activity when we talk about touring collections. I would like to mention the Battre la Campagne Artistes et Paysans exhibition, and Julie Crène was co-curator. And I would like to mention the container called Bartele, which is a container designed as an exhibition room so that they can put this onto the back of a lorry and actually go around Reunion Island, visiting spaces that are quite geographically remote in the mountains, for instance. This is another example. There's another one called Un établissement, une œuvre, that also takes exhibitions to schools. And I think that there is something that we should do in terms of bringing initiatives together in France between these FRAC and museum initiatives for touring. Many have been designed in recent years, and I think that we have a lot to learn from one another, and also surely many surprises. And as Natalie said, and Selma, these are fundamental in order to promote collections that are perhaps struggling. That's what Elie also said. And this also feeds back into this heritage in La Meuse. And Selma was also talking about this. It's about this relationship with the collections, which is essential for accessibility. So thank you very much.
Just a little bit of an addition, which goes in a bit in the other direction. We received a truck called the Mirimus, which was created through a cross-border cooperation between Spain and France across the Pyrenees. We received it in Bordeaux. It came to the city in Bordeaux, coming out of the mountains with a big truck. It was great. Thank you very much. Are there any questions or comments from the people who are still with us? I can't see any questions in the chat, but do raise your hand if you have any comments or questions for our speakers. Do make the most of this opportunity, or perhaps share any experiences that you would like to share. So there's a message of congratulations to all the speakers. Thank you for these very interesting presentations. We've just seen that in the chat. Philippe Mafra. This question of mobility is something that I've been working on for about 35 years. I'm an architect and I've had containers in Peru and we did mobile exhibitions abroad in Colombia. And every time we have a great hesitation on the part of museums. I remember that when we were working in Colombia with a big French institution went to see them, and there was a real hesitation, and we developed this with the Louvre Museum, thanks to Geneviève Brest and Lucienne Brouillette. We developed a first facsimile exhibition in order to get things going, and it worked really well because then we were able to develop exhibitions of original works. But there's a real need for work for acceptance in rural needs and in countries outside Europe. There's a lot of things going on with a great deal of very competent people. And I think in the projects that we put together, we really need to have about less than 10% of the projects we've tried to get going have worked. And in terms of the 90% failure rate, the majority of it is due to hesitancy from the Paris world. And that's a bit of a shame, I have to say, because there's really a great deal of resources outside Paris in the country areas. I'm delighted to have someone from Africa with us. There's some amazing things going on in South America, and I think there's just a little bit too much posturing that goes on in our Paris world. And I'd really like us to be able to develop things. We're starting to develop theatre festivals in the countryside where people don't go into theatres, and it's a lot of fun, and we can get to do some really incredible things in terms of people's motivation. It's really very remarkable. I think what you're saying is really very true, and we've talked a lot about a kind of connections in rural areas between heritage, know-how, contemporary art, and in my experience of managing a FRAC contemporary art regional fund, often one of the uh, first pieces of infrastructure that a small municipality will have, it will be an auditorium, a polyvalent multi auditorium alongside a library. Those will be the key pieces of infrastructure that a small municipality will perhaps have. And this is something that we need to be aware of, and we need to understand that we're going to have to work in those kind of contexts. We did something in the mountains in town to save a village together with the uh, elected representative. We bought a restaurant which was closing down, and in a village of 500 people, we put together a library and a concert hall in this whole place. And all of this works with a association contract on the basis of a grant that we received, on the basis of the fact that the person running the restaurant had a public mission for 2 days a week, and about a third of the population of this local village are signed up for this local library, and we run a whole number of different projects with them. So in this tiny little village, we're able to just do an incredible piece. So everything's based on the motivation of people. There are 10 or 15 of us working together. I'm based in Paris, but I spend a lot of time in these little regions in a long way in rural areas in the town. It's incredible to do this kind of incredible work. Thank you very much. I also want to just highlight something that was done outside of museums, which doesn't involve original works, but we're starting to do operations in shopping centers because shopping centers bring in people from urban areas as well as people from rural areas. These are places where people come from suburban areas. I wanted to just mention this word, that suburban or perhaps peri-urban areas, places that are in between urban areas and rural areas. These are spaces that we might consider as places for transport. I can see that Catherine Gadon wants to speak. Can you hear me? Yes, good evening. So thank you very much. It's really been very interesting. So I am now retired, but I was a member of an international ICOM committee, UMAC, and I was responsible for cultural action in universities. I am now vice president of an association which is going to be setting up and launching its museum on the 21st of September. And this museum is focused on an internationally renowned person, Pierre Fairbairn. And so this is the house in which he was born. And what I've noticed in the different presentations, it's often tied into a building, a house, a castle that is found in a rural area and makes it possible to develop a cultural activity and an artistic activity. And you were talking about networks. We are in the network of famous personalities, which has been certified by the French Ministry of Culture. Within ICOM, I saw a committee called Historical Dwellings. That's an international committee. I don't know whether there is a way to network together with them and talk about the operation and how we can bring all of this together, and perhaps also have some mobile exhibitions. That would be really very interesting. I think this is a question that is really open to everyone in the room. Feel free to answer in terms of, it's true that a lot of people with us here are working with specific buildings and working with this past history in order to develop a future history and develop future histories, future stories that we can share with others, as we heard from the presentation about what's happening in the Meuse in northeastern France and also the Alpes-Maritimes in the southeast of France. And these are really very full of potential and opportunities. There are also some, so just going to break in here because Mrs. Gadon, I think you're talking about DMIST, which is an international community which still exists. It's focused on historical dwellings. And if you're interested in following what they're doing, I think you could probably find some French members that could put you in touch with them. But if you have a look at their little website, if you go through the international ICOM website, ICOM international website, you'll be able to connect in there. Thank you very much. There's also a question here in the chat about whether there was a review of the Microfolie project, which is an innovative cultural approach with mobile exhibitions. But I haven't got any up-to-date information about that. There's also a question about rurality and museums, which is where we really started tonight, and about the fact that there is a connection, this fact of we're working between Paris and the provinces in France. It's true that we've worked on this separation between um, urban areas and rural areas, but this comment that we're reading in the chat is that this takes us back to the foundations of museums and museology, museums, and shows us that initiative is actually going on everywhere, that sometimes we're not fully aware of what's happening, but there is thinking about the broader museum community. This is a very important part of what we're doing. And what we're really thinking about is who and how can we get access? What are the social limits? We've not really come back to this very much, but this question of the potential of mobility, something that we've haven't talked a great deal about, but I think it's very important. We've talked about tourism, we've talked about local communities, we've talked about the circulation of work, we've talked about mobile exhibitions. There's also this question of school buses, which is an important issue for all of us. How can we get as many people as possible moving, perhaps on the basis of this school bus question, which links into other financial challenges that we face, perhaps. Perhaps Marie Lecasseur, perhaps you could wrap up for us. Yes, I just wanted to come back to this question of micropholie. We've got a mobile micropholie in Meuse in northeastern France, and we have a cultural outreach agent who travels with it. And some of the criticisms we've had of micropholie is that there've been a lot of national works that are presented, but where we're working with the Departmental Contemporary Art Fund, and we've been working with works from museums within our Grand Est region. So I think that is a program that's actually carried out in a lot of contemporary art funds. The major collections from local authorities and national museums, which were at the basis of the micropholie project. Of course, I forgot to say it, but we're also with the famous people, famous personality network. I don't know if we can just have one last minute because Benoit Vazé wanted to speak very quick. This can be really just a very brief minute because we have our translators who are doing on overtime at the moment. So I just want to very I run a art center in Saint-Omer in the north of France, and for over 20 years now we've been doing contemporary art creation projects with rural museums in Belgium and in England, also in Flanders, in regions around northern France. What we seek to do is to do contemporary art creations based on collections. These are very specific collections. You've talked about these. This creates incredible resources for contemporary artists, and which involves volunteers who have really appreciated these events that we've run, and they've really enjoyed discovering museums. And just very quickly to say, you've been talking about libraries, but we've also sought to connect local populations into our work through local media libraries. And generally, they know these small museums really very well because small museums have small teams of volunteers. They're really very dynamic. with a great deal of motivation, and it's a real great fun to work with them. So I'll wrap up there.
So I do hope that we will have an opportunity to talk together. There is just one final comment about the crisis in French agriculture. Yes, this is another important aspect that is present in Combattre la campagne, which is an exhibition. I would encourage that you read the catalogue. This was not the perspective and the stance that we chose to adopt today, but it is. Instead, we wanted to highlight the cultural innovations that are spread across France and what we still call rurality in France and in Chad as well. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you. So many of you decided to remain on the call with us to the very end. So I would like to thank ICOM France for this invitation. I thank INP and all of the speakers this evening. Thank you for everything that you shared. And this conversation will continue between ourselves. Thank you very much, Annabelle, for leading the session today. Thank you so much for these rich discussions and your interest in these subjects. And it really is encouraging to see the commitment of our professionals on varied scales right across France and beyond. I wish you all an excellent evening. The next meeting will be coming up. We will be looking at sustainable development again, and we will be talking about this in many formats. So I wish you an excellent evening, and thank you as well to our translators who stayed later than planned so that we are able to welcome foreign participants. And we do thank you for your hard work for many years now. Thank you.